Silas Harrow shook the sixth bolt open so the whole warehouse could see. It was already split, and the split ran the length of the piece a little way in from the right edge. 6 out of 11, he said. Everyone off her looms. Benjamin Cross, the Liverpool draper who had ordered it, said nothing. Alice Mercer had woven at Moorfield 11 years. In December she reported the right edges coming through rough, and it went into the fault book under Ellen Shaw's name. "Take your things," Harrow said. "You're finished here." Cross cancelled the standing order. 6 weeks later, a Preston bank called in what Harrow owed. The gates of Moorfield Lower Weaving Shed were chained, and a notice set the sale of its 24 power looms for the 16th of June. On the 12th of March, she asked Edmund Ray, agent for the creditors, for 90 days in the empty shed. He gave them on an operating lease, coal and yarn paid as used, the machinery unharmed, and 1 full bolt of cloth accepted in writing by a named buyer before the auction. Then she laid 6 samples from the returned bolts along the inspection table and took out her mother's brass gauge. The centers were sound, the left edges were sound. On every strip the tear began 5/8 of an inch in from the right edge. The same 5/8, on cloth from 6 looms, woven by 4 women in 3 different weeks. Bad yarn does not choose a side. The gauge was a plain thing, 6 inches long, marked in 16ths, with a small notch at one end for hooking over a selvage. Her mother, Hannah Mercer, had used it for 19 years as a cloth looker at a mill in Padiham and gave it to Alice the week she went into the weaving shed. She said one thing when she handed it over: "Measure before you argue." She died of a chest complaint in 1872. Alice pulled threads from the center of each strip and from the left selvage, which is the finished edge a loom weaves for itself, and rubbed them between finger and thumb. Ordinary Egyptian cotton, 32 count, no worse than the mill had run for years. She wrote that down so she could not talk herself out of it later. If the yarn had been bad, the cloth would have failed anywhere. Edmund Ray was 57, and he had the tired manner of a man who had walked through a great many dead workshops. While she measured, he went along the shed with a lamp, because roofs decided prices and he wanted to see this one. The building ran long and low, stone at the base and brick above, with a sawtooth roof whose glass all faced north, so the light fell even and never swung across the cloth. 2 of the roof drains had blocked with moss and there was standing water under them, black and still, 3 inches deep at the deepest. 24 looms stood in 4 rows under a gray film of dust and oil. The overhead line shaft ran the length of the shed with the cross shafts branching off it, and the leather driving belts hung slack. In the engine house, the beam engine had been left with water in it. "It will fetch £280 at auction," Ray said. "Perhaps 300 if a Nelson man wants the looms. It will fetch more running." That is what Mr. Harrow told the bank in October. He wrote for a while in his notebook. Then he asked her what she thought had torn the cloth, and she told him the truth, which was that she did not know, only that it had happened on the right-hand side of 9 looms and nowhere else. She knew the number, because the office had been left as the inventory clerk found it, with a paper seal on the cabinet and everything listed by drawer. The returned batch sheets were in the 3rd drawer down. Every piece of cloth woven at Moorfield carried its loom number and its weaver's number, and every piece Cross sent back was recorded there. Alice copied the loom numbers onto the back of an old invoice. There were 9, 4, 7, 11, 12, 15, 16, 19, 20, and 22. She had woven on 3 of those, and on 4 others that were not on the list at all. 13 women had worked those 9 looms in the 6 weeks before Christmas. Whatever ruined that cloth had not cared who stood in front of it. Beatrice Holt was 41, a warper by trade, which meant she prepared the long lengthwise threads, the warp, and wound them onto the beams that fed the looms. She also kept the Women's Mutual Aid Fund, a tin box in her kitchen with £31 and 8 shillings in it, gathered a penny and 2 pence at a time since 1871. 14 women had a claim on that box. £12, Beatrice said, when Alice had finished. "Not a shilling more until I see cloth. 12 won't buy coal and yarn both. Then it will buy coal, and you will go and beg the yarn, and if you lose the 12 I can still bury Sarah Lunn's mother when the time comes." Beatrice put the lid back on the tin. "I've watched men spend everything on a thing that nearly worked." Thomas Pike came in on the Thursday. He was 63, an engine minder who had started as a greaser at 14, and he had minded the Moorfield engine for 22 years. He walked the shed for 2 hours with a lamp and said nothing at all, which Alice had been warned about. "Boilers sound," he said at last. Wants the tubes cleaning and the safety valve freeing. Engine will run. Shafting's out of line in the middle, and half your belts are perished. How many looms can I run? 4. Properly, 4. I'll not put a load on that middle bearing until I've had it apart, and I can't have it apart while the shed's wet. 4 is enough to test with, Alice said. Pike looked at her. Test what? She took him to loom 19, which was one of the 9. At the front of every loom, close to where the cloth is formed, sit a pair of small devices called temples, one at each side. They hold the cloth out to its proper width while it is woven, so it does not draw in. The rotary sort at Moorfield used small toothed rings that turned against the cloth near the selvage and gripped it there. She turned the right-hand temple ring over with her thumbnail. The teeth were coarse, wider apart than she liked, and along 2 of them she could feel a rough lip of metal, a burr, where something had been cut badly at the works. Loom 4. The same. Loom 20. The same. Then she checked loom 9, which was not on her list, and the right-hand ring there was a different pattern altogether. Finer, older, worn smooth and bright. Somebody changed rings, Pike said. On some of them. Then get your rings right, and stop worrying about it. He went back to the engine house. She had 12 pounds. Coal was 11 shillings a ton from the Cliviger pits, and Pike said she would burn near 2 tons getting steam up and holding it a fortnight. Belting was the worst price. 100 feet of 4-inch leather came to £5.12, so she bought 40 feet and cut the rest out of 2 old belts that had been stored inside and were still supple. That left the yarn. She walked to Blackburn on the 17th of March and put the case to Walter Dean, 44, a yarn agent who had sold to Moorfield for 9 years and lost £41 when it closed. He gave her £400 weight of 32 count on 30 days credit, at a shilling and a penny the pound, and told her plainly that he did it because a working mill might pay him eventually, and a sold one never would. The rest of March went on work that put nothing in the warehouse. 6 women came and were not paid, on the promise of 8 shillings a week each, as soon as there was cloth to sell. Ellen Shaw, 33, went up on the roof with a ladder and a bricklayer's trowel, and cleared both block drains, and the water on the shed floor was gone in 2 days. Martha Kell, 19, who had been a winder, dried the warehouse floor and set the yarn on trestles 6 inches clear of the flags, because damp cotton weaves badly and rots quietly. Pike cleaned the boiler tubes, freed the safety valve, found 1 leaking steam union, and spent 3 days on the engine with paraffin and rag before he would let anybody put a fire under it. He lined up the 2 cross shafts that fed looms 1 to 8, and condemned 9 belts and hung them in the yard where nobody could put them back on by mistake. Alice worked in a charcoal dress and a faded blue apron with her hair pinned under an indigo kerchief, and she cleaned and leveled 4 looms herself, 19 and 4, which were on her list, and 9 and 2, which were not. She took a spirit level to each and packed the feet with slate until the frames sat true. Then she wrote a sheet for every loom in the shed, 24 lines, giving the number, the temple type on each side, and whether the teeth were coarse or fine. 9 looms had coarse right-hand rings. 15 had fine. Every left-hand ring in the building was fine. On the 24th of March, she wrote to Benjamin Cross. She did not ask for an order. She asked whether he would look at a trial length if she paid the carriage, and told him what she had measured. 5/8 of an inch, 6 strips, 4 weavers. His reply came in 5 days, and it was 7 lines long. He would look at 120 yards of 39-inch shirting. He would pay 7 pence a yard if it passed his own inspection, and nothing at all if it did not. He would not put his name to anything more until he had handled cloth. Silas Harrow heard about the reopening on the 2nd of April. He came to the gate, looked at the smoke coming off the chimney for the first time since February, and told Alice she would find nobody in Lancashire willing to sell her warp yarn once it was known who she was. Walter Dean sold me £400 weight on Tuesday, she said. Then Walter Dean is a fool with his own money. He put his hat back on. You'll tear that cloth exactly as you tore mine, Miss Mercer, and then everybody will have it settled. Steam came up on the 4th of April at 5:30 in the morning. Pike ran the engine for 40 minutes with no belts on, then brought in the first cross shaft, and the shed filled with the sound it had been built to make. Alice ran the 4 looms at 140 picks a minute, which is slow. A pick is 1 throw of the shuttle across the loom, 1 crosswise thread laid in, and Moorfield had normally run at 180. Before she started, she took every coarse right-hand ring off the 4 looms, sat at the office table with a fine file and a candle, and worked the burrs off the teeth. It took her most of a night. She filed until every tooth was smooth to the pad of her thumb, and she was pleased with the work, and she put the rings back at the depth she found them. The first strip came off loom 19 at 11 in the morning. 12 yards. She carried it to the inspection table and went over the right selvage inch by inch with the gauge and a magnifying glass borrowed from Sarah Lunn's father, who mended watches. Clean. No punctures, no roughness, no line of weakness 5/8 in. She rolled it, folded it, unrolled it, and pulled it hard along its length, which is what a warehouseman does without thinking, and it held. Ellen Shaw laughed out loud. Martha Kell fetched the other women in off the winding frames, and somebody said what everybody was thinking, which was that Silas Harrow had bought bad rings and blamed a woman for them, and that it had taken 4 days to prove. Alice was as certain as any of them. She noted the strip as trial 1, 12 yards, loom 19, filed rings, 140 picks. Then she made her first mistake, which was to label the strips after cutting instead of before, and by evening she had 2 12-yard lengths, and could not say which was 19 and which was 4. She burned both entries out of the book and ran the pair again, and lost a day and 11 pounds of yarn. On the 8th of April she authorized a long run. She had 120 yards to make for cross, and she brought the looms up to 180 picks a minute, which was commercial speed, the speed a mill has to hold to earn anything. The tearing did not come back. She held on to that for 2 days. What came instead was slower to see. The cloth off loom 4 began to draw in. At 40 yards, Alice measured 38.5 inches where it should have been 39.5. At 60 yards, it was 38 1/8. The right selvage had a soft, loose look, and the last 20 yards would not lie flat on the table at all. Small ripples ran in from the right edge, a hand's breadth of puckering that no amount of pulling took out. She stopped the looms on the 11th of April, and stood at the table with 94 yards of shirting that no draper in England would buy. She sent it to Cross anyway, because she had told him she would, and because she wanted to know exactly how a buyer would say no. He wrote back in 3 days. The cloth was narrow, the width was inconsistent, and the right selvage was slack. He returned it at her expense and repeated that he would pay for 120 yards of 39-inch cloth and nothing else. That failure cost £4 2 shillings of yarn, 6 days of 6 women's work, and 1,100 weight of coal. Beatrice Holt came to the shed on the 14th of April with the tin under her arm and did not open it. "You filed the teeth off," she said. "I filed the burrs off. You filed the teeth until they could not hold. That temple has one job. It grips the cloth at the edge and keeps it out to width. You took its grip away, so it stopped cutting, and it stopped holding." Beatrice put the tin on the table. "There is 19 pounds 8 in there, and it is not mine. Alice, tell me honestly, do we give the lease back now and lose 12, or do we go on and lose 31 and Sarah Lunn's mother goes in a parish coffin? Give me a week. I will give you a week, because I have known you since you were 17. I will not give you the tin." Alice worked the week at the inspection table, which is where she should have started. She took the 6 original return strips and one of the new puckered lengths and laid them out under the north light. On the old strips, along the line of the tier, she found what she had been looking at for a month without properly seeing. The tier had not begun as a tier. It had begun as a row of small punctures, each one a pinprick where a tooth had bitten through, sitting in a line as regular as stitching. Where the cloth had not yet come apart, she could count them. She measured the spacing with the brass gauge and the watchmaker's glass, 3/16 of an inch between punctures. Every strip, every loom. Then she went out into the shed and measured the teeth on the rings themselves. The coarse rings off the 9 looms had teeth set 3/16 of an inch apart. The fine rings on the other 15 were spaced 1/16, 3 times as close, each tooth taking a third of the bite. The second thing was depth. Pike had a small gauge for setting temples and had never once been asked to use it. The coarse rings stood proud of their beds by a full 16th more than the fine ones, which meant the teeth were not resting on the cloth, they were driving into it. The third thing she found on the 15th of April, above loom 11, and it was chalk. Every loom took its power from a belt off the cross shaft, and the speed depended on which pulley the belt sat on. Somebody had chalked a line beside each pulley to mark where the belt had been. On 9 looms, the chalk and the belt were not in the same place. The belts had been moved to the larger pulley, which made the loom run faster, and nobody had rubbed out the old marks because nobody expected the shed to be looked at again. She counted the shifted belts. 9. She checked the numbers against her list. 4, 7, 11, 12, 15, 16, 19, 20, and 22. The office records were still under the creditor's seal, so she wrote to Edmund Ray, and he came over on the 18th and sat in the corner with his hat on his knee while she went through the drawers, which was the condition. The invoice was ordinary. A single sheet from Hartley & Sons, machine makers, dated the 11th of November 1875, for 9 right-hand rotary temple rings, coarse pattern, at 1 shilling and 9 pence each. Beside it in the same bundle was a quotation from the same firm for 9 fine pattern rings at 3 shillings and 3 pence, which had not been ordered. The delivery note showed the rings arriving on the 16th of November. All 9 looms went back into work that same week. The last paper was a slip in the fitter's file, unsigned, in a clerk's hand. It said, 9 looms to the top pulley from Monday, by Mr. Harrow's instruction. Alice put the 4 papers in the only order that made sense of everything she had measured, and then she could see the whole shape of it. In November, Silas Harrow had a contract with Benjamin Cross for 11,000 yards before the end of January, and a bank in Preston asking questions about a loan he had renewed twice. 9 of his temple rings were worn out. The right pattern for 32-count shirting cost 3 shillings and 3 pence. He bought the coarse pattern at 1 and 9 pence, saved 13 shillings and 6 pence, and told the fitters to set them and get on. They set them the way you set a coarse ring on heavy cloth, deep, because a coarse tooth has fewer teeth and has to bite to hold. On shirting that was far too deep. Then in the same week, to make the January date, he put those 9 looms up onto the top pulley. So each of them had a wheel of hard teeth, spaced 3/16 apart, set too deep, turning faster than it had ever turned, against the same narrow band of cloth 5/8 of an inch in from the right selvage. Each tooth punched. The cloth came off the loom looking whole, because a row of pinpricks is not a hole. It was rolled, folded, stacked, carried, and unrolled at a draper's counter in Liverpool, and along that perforated line it came apart from one end to the other. Alice had put it in the fault book in December. It had gone in under Ellen Shaw's name, and it had been read by a man who already knew what he had ordered. "You'll want copies," Ray said. "I want the papers left exactly where they are and listed by you," Alice said, "and I want a copy of the list. If I take them, he'll say I invented them." She wrote to Hartley & Sons that night and ordered 9 right-hand rings, fine pattern, and they wrote back that the pattern was discontinued. On the 22nd, she went out to Padiham to a jobbing machinist named Ezra Kent, 38, who cut small gears for looms and clocks and anything else that came in the door. She gave him a worn fine ring off loom 9 as a pattern and asked him to cut 18 at 1/16 spacing. He quoted 2 shillings and 9 pence a ring in 10 days, £2 9 and 6 the lot, and Beatrice released the money on the condition that Alice showed her the drawing first. Harrow came back to the mill on the 25th of April. He walked the length of the shed without being invited, stopped at loom 19, and looked for a long time at the right-hand temple where the coarse ring had been taken off and not yet replaced. "You've had my office open," he said. "The creditor's office. Mr. Ray was here." 9 rings, Harrow said. 9 rings and a chalk mark, and you think that's a case. It isn't a case. It's a reason. Alice pulled the 24-line sheet toward her. "Come and watch a loom run." He did not answer that. He asked instead what she was paying Walter Dean for yarn, and when she told him, he said a shilling, and a penny was a fool's price, and that Dean would want a great deal more when he understood what he was lending his name to. Then he left, and Alice understood, more slowly than she should have, that she had just told a frightened man which thread to pull. The rings came on the 5th of May, wrapped in oiled paper. Kent had cut 19 and charged for 18, because one had come out proud, and he had made it again. Alice fitted one to loom 19 herself. She set the depth with Pike's gauge, so the teeth stood exactly as far proud as the old fine ring on loom 9, and wrote the setting down. Then she ran 3 trials on the same warp and the same yarn. At 140 picks a minute, she wove 20 yards and measured the width at 8 points, 39.5 inches, 8 times. At 180, she wove 30 yards and measured at 12 points, and got 39.5 at every one but 2. At 220 picks, which was Harrow's speed, she wove 10 yards and stopped. The punctures were back within 4 yards, a neat line of them, 3/16 apart, 5/8 in from the right edge. The correct ring at excessive speed still bit through. She wrote that down too, because it was the thing she would need most later. She settled on 195 picks a minute, faster than the mill had run before the trouble and slow enough to keep the cloth whole. She worked out what it cost her, because Harrow would ask it sooner or later. 220 picks against 195 came to about 13 yards more in every 100, in the same hour, off the same loom. That was the whole of his advantage, and every yard of it came back on a cart. The 120 yards for cross went out on the 11th of May, woven on looms 19 and 4, measured at 48 points, and recorded on one sheet with every setting on it. He came himself on the 16th. He ran the piece out its full length, took his own steel rule from his bag and measured it at 9 places without being asked. He turned the right selvage to the north light and went along it with his thumbnail. He rolled 12 yards tight, unrolled it, and pulled it hard along the length. 7 pence, he said, and counted out £3 10 shillings on the table. I want 600 yards a week, Alice said. 7 pence halfpenny. You want, Miss Mercer, and I want to know that 600 yards a week does not come out of you standing over 2 looms at a speed no mill can afford. He put his rule away. Mr. Harrow has written to me twice. He says your method is careful and slow, and that any fool can weave soundcloth if he does not care what it costs. He wants a comparison. So do I. Then we will have one, in this shed, with witnesses, and I will bring the same yarn to both looms. The 4th of June. If your cloth holds width at a working speed, I will sign for 600 yards a week for 12 weeks. If it does not, I shall buy in Bolton and think no more about it. Walter Dean's letter arrived on the 21st of May. He was sorry, but he could no longer supply on 30 days, and would want cash against delivery. Alice went to Blackburn again. Dean would not look at her for the first few minutes, and then he did, and told her the truth, which was that Silas Harrow had spoken to 2 spinners in Accrington about a man who supplied a mill being run without proper title, and that a yarn agent lives on his name. Am I being run without proper title? I don't know what you're being run on, Dean said. That's the trouble. She had Ray write to him. One paragraph on the bank's paper, stating that Alice Mercer held an operating lease on the Moorfield Lower Weaving Shed dated the 12th of March, and that the creditors consented to the working of the machinery. Dean supplied again, cash against delivery, at £1 shilling and 3 pence, 2 pence a pound dearer than before. She could afford £200 weight and no more, and the extra 2 pence on it came to £1 13 and 4 pence out of the tin. On the 27th of May, Harrow tried the other thing. He came with a carter and a written claim that looms 16 and 22, with 110 feet of belting, were his personal property, bought with his own money in 1873, and never entered into the partnership. The tailboard was already down. Alice sent Martha Kell running to the telegraph office. Then she stood in the doorway and told Harrow that the inventory taken in February listed every loom by number as part of the secured machinery, and that anything he took out of the shed he would be taking out of a bank's security. You have no standing here at all, Harrow said. I have a lease, and you have a claim. Bring the claim to Mr. Ray. Ray's reply came the next morning, and it was short. Looms 16 and 22 were listed at items 19 and 25 of the inventory of the 24th of February, to which Mr. Harrow had put his own signature. Any personal claim would be dealt with after the sale or after the lease, and not in the yard. It cost Alice a day and a half and a telegram at 8 pence. Harrow's carter was paid 4 shillings for nothing, which she heard later from Jim Crossley, 26, who carted her coal, and had a brother with a lurcher that won £11 at a coursing meeting, and was sold for 2. By the 30th of May, 18 looms were running. They had got there in stages, 4 to 8 in the first week of May, 8 to 18 over a fortnight, with Pike aligning each cross shaft before he would belt anything to it. The winding room was going with 3 frames, and Beatrice had 4 beams warped and waiting. 12 of the women who had lost their places in February were back, on 8 shillings a week until the first payment came in and 17 after it, and Alice had written all 12 names in a ledger with the rate against each. On the 2nd of June, 2 days before the comparison, the mill stopped. It began as a smell that Alice noticed at the far end of the shed and could not name, and then Pike was moving faster than she had ever seen him move, and the engine was shut, and the whole line shaft was slowing with 18 looms dragging on it. The central bearing that carried the shaft over the middle of the shed had run dry, and was hot enough to blister the paint on its cap. Off, Pike said. Everything off. Leave the warps. They lost 4 hours letting it cool, because he would not have water near it. Then he had the cap off and the brass out. and the brass was scored deep in 3 places, and the oil hole was half blocked with hard grease packed in years before. He scraped and bedded it on the office table with a candle and a bearing scraper. Alice's part was to keep out of the way, which she found harder than the diagnosis had been. She went along the 18 looms and covered every open warp with sheeting, because a warp left standing for 2 days is a warp you resize or throw away, and she had 4 beams and no money to warp more. Pike had the shaft turning again at 4 in the afternoon on the 3rd of June. He ran it light for an hour, then with 4 looms, then with 12, and put his hand on the bearing cap every 10 minutes for the rest of that day. Walter Dean brought the test yarn that same evening, 200 pounds weight of 32 count from 1 spinner and 1 lot, sealed, and Ray broke the seal in front of him and Alice both. Beatrice warped the 2 beams by lamplight and had them in the shed before 10. That night she counted what was left in the warehouse. Enough for the comparison and 1 full commercial bolt, and nothing after that. The 4th of June was a Sunday for nobody in that shed. Benjamin Cross arrived at 7:30 with his own steel rule and a clerk. Edmund Ray came from Preston. Dean came back from Blackburn to say in front of witnesses that both beams carried his yarn out of the same lot. Ezra Kent stood at the back with his hands behind him and said nothing all morning. Alfred Nye, 70, who had been a tackler at Moorfield for 30 years and had no business there at all, sat on an upturned skip by the door and watched. Silas Harrow came at 10 minutes to 8. They used looms 19 and 20. Both were 40-inch looms on the same cross shaft, both leveled and cleaned in April, and both were set to weave 39-inch cloth. Cross had every setting recorded on paper before a wheel turned, and his clerk wrote them down and read them back aloud. On loom 20, Harrow's settings. Right-hand ring, coarse pattern, teeth at 3/16, set to the depth the Moorfield fitters had used in November, which Pike measured in front of everybody and called out. Belt on the top pulley, 220 picks a minute. On loom 19, Alice's. Right-hand ring, fine pattern cut by Ezra Kent, teeth at 1/16, set to the depth off loom 9 and read out from the gauge. Belt on the standard pulley, 195 picks a minute. You agree those are your settings, Cross said to Harrow. They are the settings that Mill ran under for 4 years, Harrow said, and if her loom cannot keep pace with mine, the rest of it is a lecture. They started at 8:30 and ran until 3:30, both looms, the same 7 hours. Martha Kell brought bread and cheese around at noon, and Alfred Nye ate his on the skip and told the clerk about a flood in 1866 that had put 4 feet of water in the yard. At 3:30, Alice stopped both looms. Harrow's had made about 43 yards. Hers had made about 38. They cut both pieces off and carried them to the inspection table under the north glass. Harrow's cloth came first. It measured 39.5 inches at the first point and 39.5 at the second, and it looked as good as anything in Lancashire. Cross went along the right selvage with his thumb, and stopped, and bent closer. Bring a glass, he said. 5/8 of an inch in from the right selvage there was a line of small punctures, evenly spaced, running the whole length of the piece. His clerk counted 22 of them in 4 inches. Cross rolled 6 yards tight, unrolled it, laid it flat, and drew his hand hard down the length, and the cloth opened along that line for 2 feet, with a sound everybody in the shed had heard before. Then he measured Alice's. 39.5 inches at the start, and again at 5 yards, and at 10, at 15, at 20, at 25, at 30, and at 35. 8 measurements, and the widest variation was 1/16 of an inch. He turned the right selvage to the light, and went along the whole 38 yards with the glass, and there were no punctures at all. He rolled it, unrolled it, pulled it, folded it, and pulled it again across the fold. 5 yards in 7 hours, Harrow said. 13 yards in every 100, Mr. Cross, given away on every loom in the shed week after week. That is not care. That is a mill running to lose money, and I have run one, and I know how it ends. Cross straightened up. You are asking me to pay for yards, he said. I do not buy yards. I buy cloth I can cut on a counter. He put his hand flat on Harrow's piece. There are 43 yards here and I cannot sell one of them, so your 13 in the 100 is 13 in the 100 of nothing. There are 38 yards there, and I can sell the lot at a price that pays her and pays me. He turned to his clerk. 600 yards a week of 39-inch shirting, at 7 pence halfpenny, 12 weeks certain, delivered Thursdays, woven at the settings recorded here this morning and no other. Write it out. He looked down the shed at the rows of stopped looms, And note that 600 yards will not take up a quarter of this place, Miss Mercer, so you had better find somebody else to fill it. The clerk wrote it out on the inspection table with the 2 pieces of cloth lying beside him. Cross signed it at 20 minutes past 4, standing in the weaving shed, and Alice Mercer signed under him with a pen borrowed from Edmund Ray. Harrow watched the whole of it from 4 feet away. When it was done, he picked up his hat off the end of the table, looked at the strip of his own cloth where it had opened along the line of punctures, and went out through the yard past the 12 women who had come in to watch. He said nothing to any of them. Alfred Nye moved his legs to let him pass the door. Edmund Ray stayed another 20 minutes. He read Cross's order twice, wrote something in his notebook, and told Alice that the auction of the 16th of June would not be advertised again, and that the bank would extend her operating lease to the end of March 1877, with rent set against takings at £4 a month. "It is not ownership," he said. "You understand that." "It is 9 months," Alice said. She spent the Monday copying out the settings sheet and the clerk's record of the test, and sent both, with a 2-yard sample cut across the width, to the 2 drapers who had followed Cross out in February. Ashworth of Preston wrote back within the week and came to see the shed on the 19th. The Rochdale house sent a man instead, Ojirotamagayat, who spent an hour at the inspection table with his own rule and went away without saying much, and their order arrived 4 days later and was the larger of the 2. The first Thursday delivery went to Liverpool on the 11th of June, 604 yards, £18, 17 shillings and 6 pence. Walter Dean was paid in cash on the 14th and went back to 30 days credit at £1 and 2 pence without being asked. Beatrice put £12 back in the tin, and then, because she had wanted to for 4 years, took it out again and opened an account at the Penny Bank in the name of the fund, with 14 women's names on the paper. By the end of June, the 3 orders together kept 18 of the 24 looms running 6 days a week. The other 6 stayed idle, because Pike would not belt them up until he had the far cross shaft apart, and nobody argued with him about bearings anymore. He greased the center bearing every morning at 6 and wrote the date on a card nailed to the post beside it. Beatrice kept the production ledger, 1 line a day for each loom, and the wage book beside it. Ellen Shaw took the winding room. Martha Kell was moved up to 2 looms at 14 shillings. Alice kept the 3rd book herself, the one with the settings in it, every ring, every depth, every pulley, every speed, along with the sheet that said which temple sat on which side of which loom. Once a fortnight she measured a sample off every loom at 8 points, and if a width moved by more than a 16th she stopped that loom before it made another yard. On the last Friday in June she sat at the office table after the engine had gone quiet, the wage book open in front of her and the brass gauge lying beside it where she always put it down. She wrote out the 12 names, and against each name the loom numbers, the hours and the rate, and signed the foot of the page and ruled it off. Then she put the gauge in her apron pocket, turned the lamp down, and went to see whether Pike had banked the fire.